Nationalism, Postcolonialism, and Globalization. Gayatri Chakravarty's Spyback, a scattered speculation on the questions of cultural studies. This essay of Spyback sadly asks two questions: what it is to be an American, and what kind of cultural studies should exist in the U.S. These become closely related to one another if we accept with Spyback that Americaness is partly defined through what is taught about culture at school. Transnational cultural studies must remain focused on language and problems of translation, as well as history, especially in two senses: history as used to legitimate the status quo, and history as a record in which the powerless or subaltern are only heard with difficulty. But cultural studies also needs to acknowledge the transformative power of capital legal rights and education upon the lives of the non-metropolitan unprivileged, a power that development models and practices merely use to bolster Western hegemony, as well as to denature the worlds of developing peoples. Environmentalism has finally become part of the dominant discourse. Development has given way to sustainable development, and growth has given way to green growth. Yet, the ruling paradigm about environmental issues continues to be biased in favor of the North and the elites of the South. This is according to Shiva. And as Shiva points out, we see each cluster issues and as individuals its anti-systematic movements rather than operative movements on the functioning system of transnational capitalism, determining itself through development as in prior to dispensation through imperialism. Both our support of culture and race identity and our distrust of general narratives stand in the way of this holistic perception rather. The point is to negotiate between the national, the global, and the historical, as well as the contemporary diasporic. We must both anthropologize the West and study the various cultural systems of Africa, Asia, Asia Pacific, and Americas as if people with historical agents. Only then can we begin to put together the story of development of a cosmopolitanism that is global, gendered, and dynamic. So that is according to Chakraborty's Spyback. So now let's go to Homi K. Bhabha. Homi K. Bhabha, the Post-Colonial and the Postmodern, the Questions of Agency. Homi Bhabha's work belongs more to cultural and literary theory than to cultural studies as narrowly understood. History and everyday life appear in his writing not so much as objects on their own account, but as example inside a mode of dense, Semitically oriented philosophical analysis, which, however, has been very influential in cultural and especially in post-colonial studies. Bhabha also explores congruences between the postmodern and the postcolonial by way of a post-structuralist theory of language. The classical structuralist distinction between language as a system, and parole, individual speech acts, is interpreted as a temporal lag between thought and expression, between daydreaming and writing, between the intention to express meaning and the verbal performance in which meaning is articulated. Bhabha also argues that each of the second moments in the series is a revision of the first, a revision in which exists the possibility for openness and contingency, the possibility, in short, of a certain freedom. For victims of colonialism, culture means strategies of survival as much as heritage. so that the gap between inherited or official meaning or ideology and its individual performance provides room for resistance and individuation. Baba also suggests that his account of semiotics provides a theoretical basis for a radically multicultural society able to incorporate cultural incommensurability, that is, internal cultures which share no values or projects. This is also, he contends, what a postmodern society is. Baba's theory is finally both anti-racist and counter-historical. The kind of cultural temporality he endorses eludes the determining pressures of ethnicity and race as well as the weight of tradition, indeed of history itself. That is what the contingency and incommensurability of his subaltern or postmodern cultural acts of signification imply. A range of contemporary critical theories suggests that it is from those who have suffered the sentence of history, subjugation, domination, diaspora, displacement, that we learn our most enduring lessons of living and thinking. There is even a growing conviction that the effective experience of social marginality as it emerges in non-canonical cultural forms transform our critical strategies. It forces us to confront the concept of culture outside objects the art or beyond the canonization of the idea of aesthetics, to engage with culture as an uneven and complete production of meaning and value, often composed of incommensurable demands and practices, produced in the act of social survival. Culture reaches out to create a symbolic textuality to give the alienating everyday an aura of selfhood, a promise of pleasure. Culture is a strategy of survival in both transnational and translational. It is transnational because contemporary post-colonial discourses are rooted in specific histories of cultural displacement, whether they are the Middle Passage of slavery and indenture, the voyage out of the civilizing mission, the fraught accommodation of Third World migration to the West after the Second World War, or the traffic of economic and political refugees within and outside the Third World. Culture is translational because such spatial histories of displacement, now accompanied by the territorial ambitions of global media technologies, make the questions of how culture signifies or what is signified by culture a rather complex issue. David Forgax, about a national popular genealogy of a concept. As David Forgax notes, his ideas remain important because they help us think about the emergence of a popular new right. The reason for this is not that the new right is an equivalent to fascism, but that alternatives to the new right are as dispersed and fragmented as they were to fascism. In this situation, educative alliances which call upon minority and subaltern but not unpopular cultural values and discourses rather than monocultural and scientific or expert rather values and skills have real potential. It is these alliances which constitute the national popular. David Forgax described that the conditions in Italy that made this possible, in particular, the absence of a national culture and language. Again, these historic conditions are especially worth recalling because they anticipate the multicultural condition in which most post-industrial nation states now exist. The term national popular is a relatively new addition to the conceptual luggage of the British left and are concepts originating in the work of Gramsci. It has been one of the slowest to arrive here. Its presence in the late 1970s and 1980s can be partly explained, I believe, by the toughening of the political climate which has taken place in this period, and by the weakening of the grip of Althusserian Marxism upon certain sectors of the New Left. In the mid-1970s, the Gramsci being discussed was mediated through the filter of Althusser, whose writings became widely known in English during the same period, the early 1970s, and who had drawn on the Italian communist works in several important respects. For Althusser's radical anti-historism and anti-humanism make problematical the moment of accusation of mass revolutionary consciousness by implicitly polarizing on the one hand a mass of subjects in ideology, and on the other the bearers of science, the intellectuals, working in the band of the party. The moment of a liberatory mass action against oppression is thus radically differed, taken off the agenda, yet at a time when the tough and flexible ideological resources of Thatcherism have proved capable of mobilizing a large popular base, the dangers of this kind of impassive became clear. It is these two things arrayed against one another, the new state formation and the heterogeneous oppositional forces, which produce the need for a concept like the national popular. So the national popular became a sort of slogan for forms of art that were rooted both in the national tradition and in popular life, and as such it became identified with an artistic style or styles. At a political level, then, there are 4 points to be noted about the national popular concept. It was elaborated in response to fascism, a conservative social bloc made up of the heterogeneous economic groups with a permanently mobilized mass base, possessing organizational reserves, military ideology which rule out a frontal attack, war, or maneuver, and favor a construction of hegemony war of position as the correct strategy to defeat it. So now let's go to Arjun Appadurai, the disjuncture and difference in the global cultural economy. Arjun Appadurai goes on to make a serious path-breaking and exhilarating suggestion which have reconfigured theories of postcolonialism, postmodernism, and globalization. He argues that we need to let go the old oppositions like global-local, north-south, metropolitan, or non-metropolitan, which divided the world in two. We need to think rather of distinct flows or scapes, which ceaselessly sweep through the globe carrying capital, information, images, people, ideas, and technologies. As they pass through national boundaries in each country, they intensify the division between the nation, the country's cultural identity and unity, and the state, the country's public governmental institutions. The central problem of today's global interaction is the tension between cultural homogenization and cultural heterogeneization, or a vast array of empirical facts could be brought to bear on the side of the homogenization argument, and much of it has come from the left end of the spectrum of media studies. What these arguments fail to consider is that at least as rapidly as forces from various metropolises are brought into new societies, they tend to become indigenized in one or other way. This is true of music and housing styles as much as it is true of science and terrorism, spectacles, and constitutions. The dynamics of such indigenization have just begun to be explored in a sophisticated manner, and much more needs to be done. This scalar dynamic, which has widespread global manifestations, is also tied to the relationship between nations and states. The new global cultural economy has to be understood as a complex, overlapping disjunctive order, which cannot any longer be understood in terms of existing center-periphery models, even those that might account for multiple centers and peripheries. Nor it is susceptible to simple models of push and pull in terms of migration theory or of surpluses and deficits as in traditional models of balance of trade, or of consumers and producers as in most neo-Marxist theories of development. The complexity of the current global economy has to do with certain fundamental disjunctures between economy, culture, and politics, which we have barely begun to theorize.